Hi, today I'll be talking about a non psycho-oncology topic for a change. I'll be talking about interpersonal communication, the key to mastering counseling skills. I was invited by the Student Federation of India at the University of Hyderabad to deliver this talk. And they wanted a topic more relating to interpersonal communication and within the area of counseling skills. At this point, I'd also like to ask you to remember that a lot of the things that we were talking about can be very well used in normal communicating circumstances and not only in the counseling backdrop, although the topic and the topics are relating it back to counseling. Right, so before I start my talk, I wanted to ask you a whole bunch of questions. Now, I know that you're sitting on the other end of the screen, so obviously you can't tell me the answers back, but I do want you to reflect on what the answers could be. And then at the end of it, I will give you the correct answers. So here are the questions. Did I live in the US? Do I play any sports? Am I an outdoorsy type of person? Can I drive a car? So what do you think is the answer to this voice? Well, here are the answers. Some of them may be a bit surprising, and some of them probably didn't surprise you at all. So no, I didn't live in the States. Yes, I do play sports. Specifically, I play squash and I swim. And yes, I'm an outdoorsy type of a person. And yes, I can drive a car. So, as I was saying, some of these may have surprised you, right? Why do you think that is? It's because we form impressions about people. We form them even if you don't even know the person. You don't know who Mahati is. You just probably are hearing a voice. And you'd have formed an impression about this voice. Maybe you Googled my profile and you found out about who I am. So you probably have a couple of pictures and my profile and this voice to go by who I am. So we form these impressions really surprisingly quickly. And what happens is then we have a sender in communication and we have a receiver in communication. But there are these filters that exist between the sender and the receiver that can change the flow or determine the flow or the style or the kind of communication that's going on between the sender and the receiver. And these filters are primarily the impressions we are forming about the sender or the receiver or that environment or whatever the topic may be. So we perceive these people in a certain way. At the very outset of this interaction, you'd have already formed an impression about me. And that will probably become the filter with which you will continue this conversation. And the two main features of impression formation are minimal information and salience. So minimal information is the things that you decide on very quickly. So you have very little information. So if you don't know who I am, then all you have is this voice and my profile. And you've decided very quickly whether I can or can't drive a car. Now, whether it's right or wrong is different. As in, not right or wrong, but whether I do or don't drive a car is not the point. You haven't seen me drive a car. But you've decided that, yes, I can or can't drive a car. The same thing with salience. We base our impressions on what pops out the most. So to you, perhaps, I have an American accent, and that probably popped out the most. And so for the guys who say, yes, I lived in the States, you're probably basing it because I have this American accent. But it's far from the truth. I'd never lived in the States. So it's all about how we're processing information about a certain person or event, mostly a person especially in our talk. We're basing it on very little information and on the information that we consider most important, most salient. So now let's move on with our talk on communication. So as you may already have guessed, there are two ways of communicating. One is the verbal and one is the non-verbal. And in verbal communication, there are four major ways of communicating, and I'll be talking about these in turn. Minimal responses. Now, minimal responses are the very basic minimum communication you need to make, verbal communication that is, to make a communication keep flowing. Now, a minimal encourager is these short phrases and showing acknowledgement, agreement, and understanding. So they're basically little phrases that we would say to allow the client to continue talking. It just kind of gently nudges them forwards. And then we have silence, which is a paralinguistic kind of communication, and it consists of pregnant silences and empty silences. Now, as you may have guessed, empty silences, especially in a counseling setup, is obviously a big no-no. It means that the conversation has hit a dead end. And therefore, there's nothing more to be adding to that conversation, and therefore it lapses into a state of emptiness. And pregnant silences are silences where people are about to be speaking, right? There's something and they're going to be saying it, and so that air, that space is filled with a pregnant silence. A silence that will be broken, that is waiting to be broken. And then there are directives in the counseling communication. Directives are where we're gently directing the client towards doing or saying something. Mostly it's doing. We can do this either by approving. So that means we are offering support or reinforcement or reassurances to the client. We're providing information. It could be something as basic as providing facts, like how long the session's going to be, how much the session's going to cost, things like that. Or providing information about resources that they can use, and direct guidance. Sometimes I know that the thumb rule is that advice giving is a big no-no. But we can offer suggestions. Now, there are two types of information seeking that we can use as a tool. One is the close-ended questions and one is the open-ended questions. Now, close-ended questions obviously give you a close-ended answer. That means they answer exactly what was been asked. So, how old are you? You're X number of years. What's your name? It'll only be one name. So things like that. An open-ended question, on the other hand, is much more, evocative, because it allows the client to talk, to open up, because they can answer anything to an open-ended question. So if somebody relates an incident to you, and you say, "Oh, how does that make you feel?" It allows them then to answer in whatever way they feel like. So here's a little bit of an exercise for you. Spot the difference. So here's a standard dialogue that can occur between a client and a counselor. And you need to point out or figure out which is the open-ended question and which is the close-ended question. Right. So as you may have guessed, this is the open-ended question because it led to a more elaborate answer. And this is obviously the close-ended question because it led to a close-ended answer. All of them. Now, this is quite common. Yes, you are going to hit a dead end at some point in your counseling session. Now, how do you get out of the dead end? You can't sit around over there twiddling your fingers, right? So, say for example, in this setup, which subjects bore you? And the client says, well, all of them. And then you hit a dead end. What you could do then is, you could open up that conversation a bit longer and open up your question a bit more by saying something like, yeah, I understand that all of the subjects are boring you, but can you explain what exactly is boring you about these subjects? And then that gently brings them back to being able to open up again. Now, in verbal communication, there are also complex responses. They can be in the form of paraphrases, and paraphrases are basically where you are offering a sounding board to the client. So you're paraphrasing what they're saying. So you're putting it in other words. What that does then is it allows the client to see it in different light, whatever it is they're saying. But it also helps you to summarize what's being said. So it offers you a check. So the client can approve or disapprove of whatever was said, and then you'll understand whether you're on the right path or not. And then we have interpretations and complex responses. Now, interpretation is genuinely a very complex response because you need to interpret what the client is saying, right? So you need to understand the stuff that's being said, that's not being said, that may lead to a bigger explanation about why they're behaving or thinking in a certain way. So it's a lot, it's very nuanced. It's a very, it's a skill that you're trained for. And then confrontation. The reason confrontation is a complex response, especially in counseling, is because you can't simply confront your client. You can't back them into a wall, right? So you need to be very gentle. A confrontation in a counseling situation is a very gentle affair. You kind of gently show them if they've hit a lull. You gently tell them that they need to do something about their situation, perhaps. So you're gently telling them, hey, hold on a minute. I think what you're doing is you're purposely hitting a dead end, or whatever the situation may be. Self-disclosure is considered complex only because you need to figure out how much and when to self-disclose. So often self-disclosure is very useful because it gives the client permission to feel or do what they're doing. And the other thing is it allows them to know that other people also experience what they're experiencing. So it kind of is a trust building experience in that sense. But you also need to understand that you can't disclose too much about yourself, and you can't you need to figure out the timing of the self-disclosure. We often do the self-disclosure when the client is feeling especially guilty, or they're genuinely thinking they're the only ones experiencing or doing what they're doing. Now, in nonverbal communication, there are different types of it. Again, I will be talking about it in turn. Paralanguage. It's not about what you've said, it's all about how you say things. I'm sure you've heard this several times, but this is especially true in the counseling setup. Now, some examples of packaging what you're saying in a more friendly or more gentle, non-judgmental fashion is to pay attention to your tone of your voice, the pitch of your voice, the emphasis on certain words. So, for example, instead of saying I'm really worried about what's going on at home for you, you could say I'm really worried about what's going on. So when you emphasize the really, it makes it sound a lot more scary than it maybe is. Making language sounds like ums and ahs and grunts, the space that you're using between your words, and the pauses also. So I'm really worried as versus I'm really worried. It makes a big difference. And then there are facial expressions. They are the window to understanding what the client is experiencing. In fact, the first couple of sessions, these are possibly the most important part of your counseling interaction, because you don't have a baseline with your client in the first few interactions, because you don't know where the reference is going to be, right? So you don't know your client very well. You don't know whether they're using angry, to really mean anger in the sense that you understand it, or maybe angry is a very commonly used word for them. You don't really know those kind of things, right? So while you're developing a baseline or a reference point, what you have meanwhile are facial expressions. Now, facial expressions again also have their own baseline. You don't know if they're pulling a face for the particular emotion because it's a meaningful pulling of face, or is it an unconscious thing that they're doing. So these are the things that we will figure out. But largely speaking, at the beginning, in the first few sessions, facial expressions are all that you have to go by what the patient is experiencing. The client is experiencing. Then we have kinesics. Now, these are body movements that are not facial and they're not eye movements, and they can include touching. We have emblems, and these are actions that are clearly substituting words. So when you wave bye, when you do the namaste, these are all actions that don't require words and you already know what they mean. And then there are illustrators. They are the body movements that you use to clarify visually what you're trying to say also. So they happen parallel to speech. So like I said over here, covering your face when you're crying, covering your mouth when you're coughing. Well, you're not saying anything when you're coughing, but it clarifies visually that you're trying to say, sorry, I'm covering my face up. Things like that. And then we have the regulators. These are the actions that regulate the flow of the verbal communication. So things like head nods and shifting in posture. I move my hands a lot, for example, because it allows me to regulate the speed at which I'm talking, because otherwise I end up talking really fast. And then there are adapters. These are actions that are done without any conscious communicative purpose. Although they do indicate inner thoughts and feelings. They don't have to be majorly meaningful, but they do give us an indication about what must be going on within the person's head. So if you're asking a question and this person is twiddling their fingers unknowingly, it is a telltale sign that this person is probably a little nervous about the question that you've asked. And then eye contact. Eye contact is an extremely important part of the counseling or any kind of interpersonal communication process. Obviously, I'm asking the questions out on the screen, but obviously you can't answer them back to me. But I do want you to reflect on these questions, because eye contact is one of the most important feature of any communicative process, right? Because if you don't maintain eye contact, it's a very frustrating communication then you'll end up having with that other person. The things that are most important to note in eye contact are duration, intensity, and culture and race. So obviously you don't want to stare too long, because that's, well, rather creepy. You also don't want to stare intensely. You don't want to look at them intensely. If a client is crying and you are looking at them really intensely, that'll freak them out, because then they'll think that, oh my God, whatever I'm experiencing is extremely serious. But you don't want them to feel that way. You want them to also have the permission to cry, but also not feel like, what they're experiencing is so intense that it could be demoralizing. Culture and race, we come from certain cultures where, for example, in India, you don't stare too long into somebody's eyes deeply, right? So these are the things that you need to keep in mind when you're maintaining eye contact. The last one is proxemics. What this is basically how you're using your space in your environment. Some research suggests that 50 inches is the right amount of distance between client and counselor. But that's just an indication or a suggestion. It doesn't mean that that is the thumb rule, because also counseling is a very intuitive, dynamic process. It really differs from client to client and counselor to counselor. But the idea is about how you're using your space around you to ensure maximum communication flow. Now, I've told you a whole bunch of things about nonverbal communication. It's probably overwhelming, right? And a lot of people ask me, well, how the hell am I supposed to remember all this? Well, there is a step-by-step way for you to remember the basics of nonverbal behavior, okay? The first one is face the client squarely. Make sure that you're not in an angle, or you're not showing your back to this person, because that kind of shows that you're involved. Then adopt an open posture that invites the client to talk, obviously, because if your whole body is pointing them and your body movements, everything is fairly open, then it allows them to feel like they can start communicating with you, start talking. And then you once in a while can lean forward, because it kind of shows the client that you're interested in what they're saying. But don't lean forward all the time, because then you can't possibly be interested in everything that they're saying. It is valuable, but some of the stuff will be more valuable than other stuff, perhaps. And obviously you don't want to always adapt a leaning posture, because sometimes you should also move backwards. Then maintain good eye contact. Now, what I mean by good eye contact is the stuff I told you just before. Make sure that the duration is optimal. Make sure that it's not way too intense. And make sure that this client is okay with the kind of eye contact you're maintaining. And finally, try to be relaxed. I know this is hard. It's easier said than done. I mean, how the hell are you supposed to be relaxed when you have so many other things, the SOLE part of it to remember, and then there's all the verbal communication that you must remember. There's a lot of interpretation that goes on. It's difficult to be relaxed. I understand. But it is important to be relaxed, because unless you are relaxed, your client will not be relaxed and willing to be talking. The flow really depends on how relaxed you are. So there are relaxation exercises you can do before the client arrives. And also you need to remember that you're also human. So if you are making a mistake, that's fine. You learn through these mistakes. So the last bit is to understand that there's a master key to the master key, which is active listening. Active listening is when you're really genuinely with the other person, and you're sharing a mutual understanding with this person, and that you're genuinely paying a lot of keen attention towards this person. So active listening is much more than hearing. Hearing is when you're hearing the words that are being said. Active listening is when you're putting it into context, emotionally, psychologically, physically, structurally, economically, socially, where you're putting all this into context, where you're with that other person, as I said. And interestingly, we speak at the rate of 150 words per minute, and we hear at the rate of 1,000 words per minute. That means we are giving ourselves a lot of extra time between what we are speaking and what the other person is speaking and what we are hearing, right? And what do we do with all this extra time? We spend 75% of the time being distracted, preoccupied, or forgetful. And 20% of the time we remember only the stuff that we've heard. So that should show you how important it is to be with the conversation, not being distracted with a mobile phone, not being preoccupied with, oh, the solar and am I sitting squarely and all that stuff, and being forgetful. Now, it's normal to have being slightly preoccupied, slightly distracted, or slightly forgetful. But it is unhelpful for us to be this 75% of our consultation, right? So here's one little exercise that you can try out. It's a Chinese whispers exercise, basically. It shows you how important it is to be actively listening, to paying close attention to what is being said. So what you need is 6 volunteers. One person comes up with, not a very complicated sentence, but a sentence that has enough number of words, and whispers this into the second person. And this way it goes down the chain. And the last person, the 6th person, says what they've heard out loud. And what you'll see is what the first person said and what the last person said is oftentimes very different. So I had tried this exercise out during the talk at HCU yesterday. And what I had said and what ended up coming out was like completely different. And clearly the volunteers were distracted and preoccupied because, well, they're standing in the front and there's a whole bunch of students watching them. So obviously they were nervous. But what I had said was something to the effect of, Sam is worried about her weight gain and she's thinking of doing a juice cleanse, but she's not very sure whether she'll stick with it. And by the end of it, what we had was something about something, and then something, and they're worried about that something. So, obviously these people were really distracted, preoccupied, or forgetful. So you could try this out also to practice or understand what active listening really is. With that, I'm done with my talk, and if you have any comments, questions, queries, whatever it is, drop me an email at mahati@iith.ac.in. Thank you.